Well, there is a story that the Cold War was capitalism versus socialism, and capitalism won. As the Cold War was coming to an end in the late 80s, I wrote an article, in fact, called the USSR versus Socialism. I was invited to write it by a left journal, which refused to publish it, and finally I published it in a small anarchist journal. But it was exactly right. When Lenin took over in 1917, one of his first acts was Lenin and Trotsky, was to destroy the socialist institutions that had developed during the revolutionary period. And he did it for principled reasons, which weren't a secret. He thought Russia was a backward peasant society, had to be driven by force to industrialization, and wasn't ready for socialism. Well, where's the battle against socialism? Or take, say, the West. Is it capitalist? I mean, do you use a computer and the internet? Do you fly an airplane? Do you use drugs? Almost all of this comes out of the state system. It comes out of the state sector. I mean, take the building where we're sitting, which happens to be built on the ruins of a lab 50, 60 years ago, in which was devoted under Pentagon funding to developing computers, the internet, microelectronics, the IT revolution, and so on. Totally paid for by the public under the pretext of defense. The Russians are coming. IBM, for example, was in there learning on government subsidies how to switch from punch cards to computers. And finally, in the 60s, IBM got to the point where they could manufacture their own computer. They couldn't sell it. It was too expensive, so the government bought it. Procurement is one of the major ways in which the public subsidized private industry. And finally, 20 years later, it became possible to make money on PCs and so on. That's the way the so-called capitalist economy works. I mean, it's not that there's no entrepreneurial initiative or consumer choice. Yeah, they're there, but they're not the driving factor. They're more at the marketing end. There is a sector of the economy that does have real market characteristics, the financial sector. And it's been a big change in the last 30 years in the economy. Starting from the 70s, particularly since the Reagan-Thatcher years, the economies have been financialized. So financial industry, which used to be maybe 3% of GDP, is now in the U.S. probably pushing a third. Meanwhile, productive industry has been hollowed out. It still goes on, but it's shipped abroad. So for the managers and the owners, it's great, but for the workers, it's a disaster. The financial sector is pretty much run on market lines, and it continually collapses. And the state has to intervene to rescue it, as it's doing now. This happens to be a big bailout, but there have been, it's periodic. That's what's going to happen in market systems. In fact, that's why the corporations were created a century ago, to try to protect the rich and powerful from market discipline, which is harsh. So, it's not false that there was certainly a conflict in the Cold War, but you can't describe it that way. In fact, if you look at the events of the Cold War, which after all ought to be relevant, the events of the Cold War are overwhelmingly U.S. attacks on movements of independence in its own domains on the pretext that the Russians are coming, and Russian actions against its own satellites on the pretext that the Americans are coming. There's almost a tacit compact in which each power, the huge superpower and the minor one, use the pretext of the other to control their own domains. And it's striking that when the Cold War ended, if you take a look at U.S. policy, it's the first thing you look at if you try to figure out what the Cold War was about. George Bush, the first, was president. Right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they announced a new national security strategy, a defense budget, and so on, which were very revealing. What they said is everything's going to remain the same except for pretexts. So we still need a huge military system but not because the Russians are coming, because they're not, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. They said that and hoped people wouldn't laugh, and were right. They said we still have to sustain the defense industrial base. That's the standard euphemism for high-tech industry. So we have to make sure that the rich can be supported by the nanny state. And crucially, they said we have to maintain intervention forces directed at the Middle East. And then comes a nice phrase, where the serious threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So in other words, sorry folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now clouds have lifted. So we have to say, yeah, we have to prevent what's called radical nationalism, meaning independence. So nothing changed except pretexts, and of course tactics are modified. And if you look closely, that's what you find.